Daniel Carter had once dreamed of turning his modest ranch into a place of pride, but years of drought, debt, and loneliness had worn him down like the wind against sandstone. Living miles from town, his only companionship came from the creak of his weathered porch and the memory of his late wife, who always believed that kindness held more strength than any rifle. One moonless night, while mending a broken fence near the canyon, Daniel heard a faint groan and discovered a young Apache warrior, bleeding and half-conscious, clearly left behind after some unseen conflict. Fear gripped him. Townsfolk already distrusted him for his quiet nature and refusal to speak ill of the tribes. He knew helping this man could cost him his land, even his life. But one look at the youth's pain reminded him of the wounded animals his wife used to nurse back to health. Ignoring the law and his own safety, Daniel lifted the stranger onto his old horse and carried him home. Under the flickering lantern of his barn, he treated the wounds using the last of his bandages, whispering, "You're safe here." In that moment, compassion overpowered caution and fate quietly shifted. Despite knowing every act of mercy toward an Assam sword and Astaward and Hassan Asod and some cowardly shifted. Despite knowing every act of mercy toward an Sensen Osam powered coward, Apache could be seen as treason. Daniel continued tending to the wounded youth in secret, hiding him deep within the barn beneath rough wool blankets. Supplies were scarce. He used the last of his herbal salve and tore strips from his only clean shirt to bind the wounds. Each passing hour was shadowed with fear. Recent tensions between nearby ranchers and Apache scouts had turned the town into a powder keg. Rumors spread quickly. Someone claimed to have seen Indian tracks near Daniel's land, and a few angry men, clutching rifles and whiskey, suggested searching his ranch. Poverty was no longer Daniel's greatest threat. Discovery was. Yet every time doubt crept in, he remembered his late wife saying, "A life saved is never a wrong done." Late into the night, he carried water quietly from the well and whispered prayers few knew he still believed in. Outside, the wind howled like watchmen. Inside, he fought fever and infection with everything he had left. He was no longer just saving a stranger, he was challenging a world built on fear. Unaware, Daniel was already altering the future with every bandage he tied. By dawn, the Apache youth regained consciousness, his eyes sharp with suspicion as he scanned the unfamiliar barn walls. At first, he recoiled from Daniel's presence, expecting pain or betrayal, for every story he'd heard of white men spoke of cruelty, not mercy. He introduced himself in halting English as Tawa, son of a warrior, and demanded to know why he'd been spared. Daniel simply replied, "Because you were hurt," offering water without asking anything in return. The gesture unsettled Tawa more than any threat could. Days passed in hushed secrecy. Daniel taught him a few English words, and Tawa shared fragments of his tribe's traditions. Though still cautious, he began eating the meager meals Daniel offered: cornbread, jerky, even half his last potato. At night, Tawa listened to Daniel quietly speak to the empty barn about his late wife, who believed all lives were sacred. One evening, Tawa whispered, "Kindness is rare." Daniel didn't reply, but the slight nod he gave held more truth than words. For the first time, the young warrior slept without gripping his knife. Their trust was still fragile, but a silent bond had begun to form, one rooted not in alliance, but in humanity. Just as the bond between Daniel and Tawa began to strengthen, danger crept closer than ever. A suspicious neighbor, Hank Willis, a harsh rancher with a bitter grudge against native tribes, noticed footprints leading toward Daniel's barn and spread whispers throughout town. That afternoon, a group of armed men, including the sheriff, rode to Daniel's ranch demanding to search his property. With only seconds to act, Daniel helped Tawa crawl beneath the loose barn floorboards and covered the spot with old hay bales. The men stormed through, shoving aside tools and kicking open stall doors, their suspicion growing with every passing moment. Daniel stood calm, masking his racing heartbeat, claiming he'd been working the fields all day. When the sheriff noticed a water bucket still wet and questioned him, Daniel casually replied that he'd given water to a stray coyote. Moments later, they rode off, but not before Hank warned he'd return with soldiers if anything seemed amiss. Just as the dust settled, Tawa's fever spiked, his body trembling beneath the floorboards. Daniel stayed by his side late into the night, using his last bottle of whiskey to reduce the fever. As Tawa drifted in and out of consciousness, he murmured, "My people will remember." By the light of the crescent moon, Tawa insisted he could remain hidden no longer. If he didn't return soon, his tribe would search for him, possibly starting a confrontation that Daniel could not survive. Though still weak, he was determined to leave before sunrise. Daniel, recognizing the danger both to himself and Tawa if he were discovered, saddled his oldest yet surest horse and helped the young warrior mount with care. The moonlight glinted off Tawa's tired eyes as he looked back at the small ranch that had become his refuge. Just before he rode off, Daniel handed him a worn wool blanket and a flask of water, his voice low as he said, "Ride carefully and live." Tawa hesitated for a moment, then lifted his hand to his chest, the same gesture used to honor a man of moral strength among his people. Daniel watched silently as Tawa disappeared toward the canyon, the hoofbeats fading into the still night. Though his barn was now empty, Daniel felt a strange peace. He believed their paths would never cross again, but took solace in knowing that, in a world built on fear, he had chosen mercy. Little did he know, it was not an ending, but the beginning. By the following afternoon, uneasy silence settled over the ranch like a storm waiting to break. Whispers of Daniel's possible involvement with the Apache turned into accusations, and by evening, the sheriff returned accompanied by angry townsmen. They didn't find proof, but suspicion was enough. They seized Daniel's last 2 cattle as war precaution and accused him of endangering the community. Hank Willis, fueled by hate and jealousy, struck Daniel to the ground and vowed that the army would be at his ranch by dawn to investigate further, hinting that if they found anything, a noose might be quicker than a trial. With his livestock gone, his barn nearly empty, and his reputation ruined, Daniel sat alone on his porch as the sun went down. Every creak of the wood felt like a countdown. Though fear gripped him, he did not regret helping Tawa. He believed that if a man's worth was measured by courage and not coin, then his choice had made him richer than any rancher in town. With exhaustion settling in, he whispered to his wife's memory, "I'd do it again." The wind carried his words into the dark toward the horizon, where sunrise would soon reveal more than Daniel could imagine. Just before sunrise, when the world was still draped in pale gray light, Daniel felt the ground begin to tremble beneath his porch. At first, he thought it was a distant storm, but as the vibration grew stronger, he stood and looked toward the horizon and froze. Emerging from the dawn mist, a vast formation of Apache warriors rode in complete silence, stretching across the plains like a living tide. Horses moved in slow unison, their riders adorned in ceremonial paint and feathered war regalia. At the front rode Tawa, sitting tall despite the bandages visible beneath his attire. Beside a stern, dignified man Daniel recognized instantly as the tribe's chief. The column halted before his ranch, 1,000 strong, not with aggression but with solemnity. Tawa dismounted and approached Daniel, every warrior watching. In a gesture Daniel would never forget, Tawa knelt before him, placing his hand over his heart, the sign of honor and deep respect among his people. The chief bowed his head and declared that Daniel had shown warrior strength of spirit and that the Apache had come not for vengeance, but to repay a debt of life. In that silent dawn, the poorest rancher in town stood honored by a nation. The chief's words echoed across the quiet plains as Daniel stood rooted, unable to comprehend the sight before him. 1,000 Apache warriors, once thought his enemies, now pledged loyalty and protection. They offered horses, skilled hands for the ranch, and food enough to restore his land from ruin. When the army arrived later, drawn by reports of Indian movement, they halted at the edge of the vast formation, realizing the futility of confrontation. Word of Daniel's courage and compassion spread quickly through the town, transforming suspicion into awe. The ranch, once struggling under drought and debt, flourished as the Apache worked alongside Daniel, sharing knowledge of the land, water, and weather patterns. Travelers whispered tales of the rancher who had risked everything to save a single life, earning the gratitude of an entire people. Daniel himself, though still humble and quiet, felt a profound sense of peace and belonging, knowing that in a world driven by fear, his choice to act with mercy had forged bonds stronger than any law or gold. The sun rose higher each day over a ranch no longer defined by poverty or isolation, but by honor, respect, and the unbreakable loyalty of a nation he had saved and who had, in turn, saved him.